Welcome back to True Unseen Crime, where shadows speak and silence is rarely innocent. On this channel, we uncover stories buried beneath fear, loyalty, betrayal, and cold deception. If you enjoy gripping true crime stories with twists, emotion, and suspense, be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a case. Lena's voice crackled through the earpiece. That's not Elaine. That's Margot Hale. Jake blinked. Who the hell is Margot Hale?
She's not family, Lena said.
She's the funder. Walter's first love. Her father was indicted in the 80s for laundering drug money through shell charities. The Hale name disappeared until now. That's when it hit Jake. His family wasn't just corrupt. They were laundering millions through fake philanthropic trusts. And Margot Hale was the real puppet master. Elaine was the enforcer. Caleb was the face. Walter was the pawn. And Jake? He was never supposed to return. The morning after Jake uncovered Margot Hale's name, everything began to spiral out of control. He thought he had uncovered the secret, the one that would give him leverage against the family. But as Lena pulled the strings from her surveillance van and the flash drive continued to decrypt, Jake realized they were only scratching the surface. The moment Jake entered the front door of the Fletcher estate that afternoon, the atmosphere felt off. It was a stillness, like the calm before a storm. The house, once so full of laughter, now felt empty, cold. Every step he took reverberated against the hardwood floors like a reminder that he was playing a game he didn't fully understand. Caleb was already sitting in the living room, drink in hand, staring out the window at the rainstorm that had rolled in. His face was hard, calculating. But it was Elaine who greeted him first. Her face had a tight, forced smile, one that had lost its warmth long ago. "Jake, how's the consulting going?" she asked, stepping forward and placing her hand on his arm in a gesture that felt more like a veiled threat than a loving embrace. He nodded slowly, keeping his cool. "I think it's going great. In fact, I've got something to show you both." Before they could react, Jake pulled out the flash drive he'd taken from Nina and placed it on the coffee table. Elaine's eyes flickered for a moment, just long enough for Jake to catch the briefest flash of panic. "I think we need to have a talk," he said, his voice steady. "It's about Dad and the truth about what's been going on here." Caleb stood, his chair scraping against the floor. "We've heard enough of your paranoid rambling, Jake. You don't know what you're dealing with." Elaine's gaze shifted to Caleb, but then back to Jake. There was something in her eyes, something she hadn't expected him to discover. Without warning, Jake hit play. The screen flickered to life, showing the footage of Walter and Dr. Langston meeting late at the office. Then came the unmistakable voice of Caleb in the background, his words clear in the recording. "We need to make sure everything is in place before Walter becomes an issue. When it's done, you'll take control. I'll handle the rest." Elaine's hand went to her mouth. Caleb froze. Jake's heart raced, but he forced himself to stay calm. "You're right, Caleb. I don't know everything. But I do know this. Walter wasn't just sick. He was taken out." Elaine let out a soft, almost inaudible sob. Caleb's face turned ashen. The veneer of control was slipping away, and Jake could see it. He was finally breaking through. But just as he thought he had them, the doorbell rang. It was unexpected. Neither Caleb nor Elaine had made any move to answer the door. But when the heavy door swung open, standing there was someone Jake had never expected to see. Margot Hale. The woman was older than Jake had imagined, but there was no mistaking her presence. She was elegant, poised, yet every step she took seemed to reverberate with authority. And behind her was a pair of menacing figures dressed in dark suits. "Hello, Jake," she said, her voice smooth as velvet but carrying an undercurrent of danger. "I think we need to have a real conversation now." Margot Hale's presence in the room was like a cold gust of wind sweeping through a room that was already full of tension. Jake stood frozen, unable to move as she stepped inside, her heels clicking ominously against the polished floors. Caleb remained silent, his face pale, his posture stiff. Elaine looked between them, her expression a mixture of guilt and fear. "Margot," Jake said, trying to regain control, but his voice betrayed his unease. "What are you doing here?" Margot's smile was sharp, almost predatory. I think you've already figured out a lot, Jake. But the full picture, well, that's something you're about to see for yourself. Elaine stepped forward, her face flushed. Margot, please. This wasn't part of the plan. He doesn't need to be involved. Margot's eyes narrowed, and she turned to Elaine. Oh, darling, I think it's far too late for that. Jake is already very involved. Isn't that right, Jake? Jake's mind raced as he tried to process the unexpected turn of events. He'd known something was off, but he hadn't expected Margot to show up, much less to confront him so openly. Margot gestured to the men behind her, who stepped forward, blocking the exit. I came here to finish what was started, she said, her voice laced with menace. The Fletcher family has always been in my debt. Walter knew it. Elaine knew it. And Caleb, well, Caleb was too blinded by his own ambitions to see that he was never meant to be in charge. Elaine gasped. No, you're lying. This isn't true. Margot gave a soft, derisive laugh. Oh, Elaine. You wanted control, didn't you? But you never understood the game. You thought Walter's will would be the key, but it was never about that. It was always about the money and who could keep it hidden from the public. The last thing we needed was an outsider like Jake coming back and making things difficult. Jake's stomach churned. The money. He hadn't fully realized it before, but now it was all coming together. The offshore accounts. The ledger. The hidden transactions. The Fletchers weren't just rich. They were complicit in a far-reaching operation that had ties to people like Margot Hale. And Walter, in his naivete, had thought he could control the situation. But the deeper Jake dug, the more he realized Walter was just a pawn in a much larger scheme. Margot moved toward the coffee table, placing a large envelope on it. Inside this envelope, Jake is your future. The one you're too blind to see. Your father's legacy can be yours if you accept it. You'll have everything. The company, the wealth, the power. All you need to do is agree to work with me, to accept the real family ties. Because, let's face it, you've always wanted to belong, haven't you? Jake shook his head, taking a step back. I don't want any of this. Margot's expression darkened. You will want it. You'll need it. The choice, Jake, is yours. But just as Jake was about to speak, the lights in the room flickered. For a split second, everything went dark. Then came the sound of shouting. Gunshots. It was chaos. The two men behind Margot had pulled out weapons, but in the darkness, someone, Jake couldn't tell who, had fired first. Get down, shouted a voice, Lena's voice. Suddenly, the lights flashed back on, revealing a chaotic scene. The two men lay motionless on the floor. Margot had a gun in her hand, but her eyes were wide in shock. From the shadows emerged a figure, a woman dressed in black, her face obscured by a ski mask. Lena? Jake gasped, still trying to process what had just happened. Lena gave him a grim nod. I wasn't going to let you walk into this alone, Jake. I've been watching their every move. When I heard Margot was coming, I had to intervene. Margot's eyes flickered with rage. You think you've won? You think this is over? But before anyone could respond, the sound of sirens wailed in the distance. Jake's mind raced. This wasn't just a family conspiracy. It was much larger. And the stakes were higher than he could ever have imagined. Margot Hale wasn't just a businesswoman with a vendetta. She was connected to a shadow network that reached into politics, law enforcement, and beyond. The only reason she had been trying to buy Jake off was because he was the last piece of the puzzle. With Walter dead, Elaine compromised, and Caleb too corrupt to see straight, Margot needed Jake to fall in line or else. Elaine stumbled backward, her face pale as she processed what had just happened. What are you going to do? She whispered, her voice trembling. Jake turned to face her, his heart heavy with a mix of betrayal and relief. I don't know yet, but it's over. We're going to finish what Walter started, and we're going to do it right. The sirens grew louder, signaling the approach of law enforcement. As the sound grew closer, Jake turned to Margot, and then to Lena. This is just the beginning, Jake said, his voice steady. But I promise you one thing. I won't be your puppet anymore. The sirens outside grew deafening, the sharp wail of approaching law enforcement echoing off the walls of the Fletcher estate. Inside, the tension was thick, each breath hanging in the air like a threat. The cold metal of Margot's gun gleamed under the lights, still in her hand, but her resolve was visibly cracking. Jake stood firm, trying to steady his breath, his heart pounding in his chest. Lena, still concealed in her tactical gear, moved closer to him. Her presence had turned the tide in a battle he'd been losing for days. Margot's expression shifted from one of surprise to barely contained rage. "You think the police can save you, Jake?" Her voice was low, venomous. "You think this changes anything?" "I think it changes everything," Jake said, his voice steady, unwavering. His eyes locked onto hers, and for the first time in days, he felt the power shift in his favor. "It's over, Margot. The only thing left is how this story ends. And you're not writing it." Margot let out a bitter laugh, but it was hollow. "You really believe that? You think I'm the villain in this story? You don't even know who you're dealing with." Jake's mind raced. He knew that Margot wasn't just another criminal mastermind. She was too connected, too influential. But the pieces of the puzzle were finally coming together. The vast network of power she had cultivated was unraveling. It had to.
He wouldn't stop until it did.
Lena moved quickly, her instincts sharp. She grabbed Jake's arm and pulled him toward the door, just as the first of the officers arrived on the property. He could hear them shouting commands outside, but there was no escaping Margot's grip on the family's empire yet. Margot, seeing her window closing, turned toward her remaining bodyguard. But before she could give an order, one of the men collapsed to the floor, a heavy thud as his body hit the marble tiles. Jake's eyes widened. What the hell? It was Caleb. With a look of pure betrayal on his face, Caleb dropped the gun he had been holding, shaking his head in disbelief. "I didn't think it would come to this. But I can't follow her anymore." Lena's eyes widened too, her gaze flickering toward Caleb. "What do you mean, Caleb?" "I've been played," Caleb said, his voice shaky, and for the first time, there was no arrogance in it, only fear. "I thought I could control this. I thought I could be the one in charge. But Margot," he glanced back at her. "She's not a businesswoman. She's a mob boss. I've been part of something much darker than I ever imagined." Margot's face twisted in fury. "You think you're going to get away with this, Caleb? You think you're going to turn on me?" But Caleb was already backing away from her, his hands raised. "I didn't know about the drugs, the laundering, the people she's killed. I didn't know any of it, I swear." Jake's gaze shifted between Caleb and Margot. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. The empire, the family, everything was built on lies, deception, and ruthless ambition. But the truth was starting to seep through the cracks. The door to the outside swung open, and police officers flooded in, weapons drawn. The room erupted in chaos. Margot raised her gun, aiming it at Caleb first, but before she could pull the trigger, another shot rang out, a deafening crack that sent everyone reeling. Caleb fell to the ground, his body crumpling in a heap. The officers advanced quickly, pinning Margot to the floor. But it wasn't the police who had fired the fatal shot. It was Elaine. Jake couldn't process it at first. His mother, who had always been the dutiful wife, the picture of grace and poise, was now standing in the middle of the chaos, holding a gun. The same gun that had just killed Caleb. Elaine's eyes were empty. Her voice was quiet, almost apologetic. "I couldn't let him ruin everything, Jake. It was never meant to be this way." Jake took a step back, shock flooding his system. His entire life, everything he thought he knew about his family, was shattered in an instant. His own mother had killed her son, her own flesh and blood, to protect the empire they had built. "Mom," Jake said, his voice barely a whisper. "What did you do?" Elaine didn't answer. She didn't have to. The officers took Margot into custody, but Jake knew this wasn't over. Not yet. There were still too many unanswered questions, too many ties to sever. The network of corruption, the lies, it was all too big to end here. Lena moved to Jake's side, placing a hand on his shoulder. "This isn't the end, Jake. It's just the beginning." The weeks that followed the arrest of Margot Hale and the shocking events of that night were a blur for Jake. The trial had been a media spectacle, but the real work, uncovering the full extent of his family's involvement, was far from over. The Fletcher empire was crumbling under the weight of its secrets. But as the dust began to settle, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that the true battle had only just begun. He had always imagined that the truth would set him free. But now, more than ever, he wondered if the truth was just a tool, something people used to manipulate, to control. His life had been a lie. And though the chains that had bound him to his family's wealth were breaking, Jake couldn't help but feel like a man caught in a storm, lost and directionless. The end of one story is the beginning of another. Thank you for watching. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more suspenseful, thought-provoking stories. Stay tuned for the next one. Who knows what mysteries await? This is True Unseen Crime.